Good evening, everybody. I was asked to introduce a guy who I sort of ran into before. A little feedback here. Larry Harris is probably the world's leading expert on the Tippit killing, and one of my oldest friends. Actually, he's not that old, but we've been friends for a very long time. I know of nobody in this case more dedicated or more helpful than Larry. And you're all in for a treat, because if you're interested in the Tippit killing, you're going to learn everything that there is to know from a man who has spent a lot of years on the subject. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Larry Harris.
Thank you, Robert. Well, we're coming down the stretch on the symposium this year, and I've had a blast. I think this has been a great symposium. It's been smaller, more relaxed, more personal, more friendly, and I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I have. And I'd like to thank some of the egomaniacs and anal personalities that have disrupted our previous conferences for not being here this year. I've genuinely enjoyed not having you this year. But last night I was socializing with some of you fine people, just minding my own business, and I was approached by a researcher who asked me if he could talk to me for just a minute about his theory on this. And, just a minute, yeah, right. And for the next 20 minutes, he proceeded to enthrall me with his theory, which was, and he imparted this to me in the most serious and solemn tone, and he has come to the conclusion that the body buried over in Arlington National Cemetery is not that of John F. Kennedy, but rather that of J.D. Tippit. People, can we please get real? At any rate, I think most of you, I'm just going to, we don't have much time, and we're running a little behind schedule as it is, so I'm going to just kind of fly through and just hit some highlights, because I want to leave a little time for question and answers. I think most of you are familiar with the basic outline of the Tippit murder, that is, that Oswald left the school book depository, made his way over to his room, got his gun, took off walking, destination, intent, unknown, just kind of wandering the residential streets of Oak Cliff. J.D. Tippit, a patrolman on patrol alone. Here's the very vague and general description of the Dealey Plaza suspect come over the police radio. Tippit makes his way over into the central business district of Oak Cliff, spots Oswald walking down this street 4 miles from Dealey Plaza from behind, and deduces, by God, I think that's him. And he pulls the man over, they chat a minute. Tippit gets out of his car to apprehend the fleeing assassin and is shot dead in the street. And Oswald flees, runs to the theater, goes in without paying for a ticket. We have, 100, 200 police officers descend on the theater. Oswald tries to kill another policeman inside the theater. They kick him around a little bit, then handcuff him and take him down to the police station. And then later that afternoon, they link the Tippit murder and Oswald to the book depository, and ta-da, case closed. But and on the deal, on the surface, it looked like an open and shut case, and at the time, the Tippit murder went a long way toward convincing the public that Oswald had killed this policeman, so therefore he must have killed President Kennedy as well. But the truth of the matter is we don't really know what happened over there at 10th and Patton in the Oak Cliff section where Officer Tippit was shot. Years later, we had private researchers identify other witnesses who had not been interviewed by the investigating authorities in '64. There was a woman named Aquila Clemens who said that she had seen two men standing at Tippit's car. and that they ran off in opposite directions. There was another gentleman named Frank Wright who said he saw a man run, jump into a gray car, and drive off at a high rate of speed west on 10th Street. And then back in the 1970s, the House Select Committee turned up still another witness named Jack Tatum, who had been driving by the scene, and he described the assailant shooting Tippit across the hood of the police car and then walking around behind the police car and walking right up to Tippit, taking careful aim and firing one more shot into Tippit. And, nobody else saw these things. Aquila Clemens didn't see what Wright saw. Wright didn't see what Tatum saw. And it's just puzzling that we can't get eyewitness accounts to match up. But I want to talk about just some of the basic problems that have come up in the years over the Tippit murder. And first and foremost are the time and distance factors. Now, according to the Warren report, Oswald left his room at 1:04 p.m. there on Beckley Street, and Tippit was shot at 1:15 or 1:16 p.m. So that gave Oswald a window of about 12 minutes to walk 1 mile from his rooming house to where Tippit was shot, from 1:04 to 1:16. But the landlady at Oswald's rooming house testified that after Oswald left, she looked out the window a few minutes later, and Oswald was standing there at the curb in front of the house. And then at the other end of it, it's quite clear that the Warren Commission misstated the time of the Tippit murder. He wasn't shot at 1:15 or 1:16 p.m. That's the time the police were notified of the shooting over the radio in Tippit's car by a bystander. And it's clear that several minutes elapsed between the time Tippit was shot and the time that the police were notified. Domingo Benavides, who was the closest known witness, said that shooting broke out. He ducked down in the cab of his truck, and he stayed crouched down for a few minutes because he was afraid this man was going to come back and start doing some more shooting. And so that 12-minute window of opportunity that Oswald had to walk the 1 mile, that is now significantly. Let's say 1:04, and let's just say the landlady said several minutes, but let's say 2 minutes. That'd make it 1:06 p.m. And then over here at 1:16, let's say Benavides says a few minutes elapsed, and then let's say it wasn't 1:16. Let's say it was 1:14. That really narrows significantly the window of opportunity that Oswald had to get to the scene of the crime. And then on top of that, they used a witness named Helen Markham to say that she saw Oswald walking east on 10th Street, and she was the only known witness to say that. You go back to the National Archives and the 26 volumes and start reading all of the reports, FBI, Dallas Police, Secret Service, and almost without exception, they state that the man who shot Tippit was walking west on 10th Street, that is, toward Tippit, and opposite of what Helen Markham said. And this would have Oswald approaching the scene, coming back toward his rooming house from a point beyond the scene of the crime that he could not possibly have reached in the known time frame. So it was seen that the time and distance factors, really effectively preclude Oswald as the killer of Officer Tippit. And then the sheer lack of credible physical evidence in the Tippit murder, and it's a mess, would seem to bear out the thesis that Oswald was nowhere near 10th and Patton when this policeman was shot down. And we have two witnesses at the Texas Theater, Davis and Burroughs, who state that they observed Oswald inside the theater moving around much earlier than the Warren report said. Warren report didn't put him there until about 1:40 p.m., but Burroughs and Davis have him there even prior to 1:15 p.m., not long after 1 o'clock, and that's pretty significant. And getting back to Helen Markham, now, this woman was something else, but they asked her what time she thought Tippit was shot, and she said about 1:06 or 1:07 p.m. And as it turns out, that's pretty accurate. And the reason she said this was every day she was a waitress at the Eat Well Cafe in downtown Dallas, and every day she would walk from her apartment up to Jefferson Boulevard and catch a bus to downtown Dallas that picked her up at 1:12 p.m. And so at the time she was waiting across the street there, 10th Street, when the shooting broke out, she was en route to and 1 block from her bus stop where she was going to board that 1:12 p.m. Bus, as was her daily routine. So the FBI did a little enactment and study of this, and they concluded that she'd left her apartment at 1 p.m. and she'd gone to the washateria there to use the pay telephone. And there was a clock there in the washateria, and she was conscious of the time, and she looked at the clock, and it was 1:04 p.m. So the FBI took a stopwatch, and they walked the distance from the washateria to where she observed the shooting, and it took 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So if she left at 1:04 and you had 2 minutes and 30 seconds, that would come out right at 1:06 or 1:07 p.m. And yet Oswald didn't leave his room till 1:04 p.m. and then stood at the curb for a few minutes. So see, it just doesn't add up. And then another clue to the possible time of the Tippit murder, and I think it happened probably at about 1:09 p.m. as best as I can determine. At 1:08 p.m., Tippit tried to call the dispatcher and got no response. There was a lot of traffic on the radio, back and forth, and the dispatcher didn't hear him or didn't acknowledge him, and that's the last we hear of J.D. Tippit. Now, at 1 p.m., the dispatcher had tried to call Tippit and got no response. Well, at 1 p.m., Oswald was inside his room, and according to the landlady, while Oswald was in his room, and he was just in there 3 or 4 minutes, a Dallas police car pulled up with 2 occupants in it, beat the horn, paused for a moment, and then drove off. And that little mystery was never explained. We don't know who was in that car. The Warren Commission let the Dallas police kind of conduct their own investigation. They said, well, we don't know who it was, what it was. So we don't know if it was Tippit. We don't know, if we had some renegade officers out doing something. We don't know the significance of it, but it's a real puzzling mystery that endures to this day. One of those unexplained aspects that we're left to wonder about. Moreover, there was a passerby named Tom Boley who came up on the scene in his car, and he is the only known witness who deliberately checked his watch to note the time, and it was 1:10 p.m. according to the affidavit that he gave that day. So it's pretty clear, that this shooting happened several minutes earlier than the Warren Commission said, and that Oswald almost certainly could not have been there in time to do the shooting. And this was a real problem for the Warren Commission, getting Oswald from his rooming house to the scene in time to do this. When David Bellin of the Warren Commission reenacted it with the stopwatch, and Bellin's the guy that wrote the chapter on the Tippit murder, and is just about the sorriest chapter in the Warren report. When Bellin re-walked this crazy route that they have Oswald walking, and it was sheer conjecture. To this day, there's not one witness ever come forward who claims to have seen Oswald walking down Beckley and this meandering route up to 10th Street. No one ever saw him. We don't know where he was going, don't know his intent, his destination. It was sheer conjecture on the part of the commission. But they were so pressed for time that the Secret Service, when they were doing the timetable to get, showing Oswald's movements and activities after the assassination, this is actually in the National Archives. There's a Secret Service report that gives Oswald 30 seconds to go into his room, change clothes, get his gun, leave, and stand there at the curb. 30 seconds. This is a government document. These were the guys guarding the president. I don't know. I guess this is to be expected. And there were several witnesses, that said Oswald was walking west on 10th Street. Jimmy Burt did. Bill Scoggins, the taxi driver, did. In fact, Scoggins, the taxi driver, was sitting there on Patton immediately in front of 10th Street eating his lunch in his taxi cab. And he vividly described Tippit cruising by slowly in his patrol car. But he didn't say anything about Oswald walking east on 10th Street like Markham and the Warren Commission have, and Oswald would have passed within feet of his bumper had Oswald been there and been walking as the Warren Commission said he was. There's a lot of discrepancies about the physical description of the man who shot Tippit. The things going out over the police radio certainly seem to be describing a man other than Oswald. We're told Helen Markham, the star witness, identified Oswald. It was probably the most bizarre identification in the history of law enforcement, but they said she did it that day, that afternoon. And yet that same day, the FBI interviewed her, and she told the FBI that the man that shot Tippit was 18, red complexion, black hair. Now, does that sound like the Oswald y'all have come to know and love all these years? And in fact, black hair and black wavy hair is a recurring theme in this description of the suspect over there in Oak Cliff running around. They took Oswald down to some police lineups, and about the first two lineups, they stuck him in there with some two detectives and a jail clerk who were neatly attired in their civilian attire, and Oswald standing there all beat up and bruised and tore up, you know, from his scuffle with the police. And then the third lineup on Saturday, or I'm sorry, the last lineup on Saturday, they stick Oswald in there with two teenagers and a Hispanic man. So Helen Markham was a star witness, and the Warren report termed her testimony reliable, and that's what they said publicly. But behind the scenes, it was a different story altogether. I found a staff summary up in the National Archives that was not published in the 26 volumes, and it warned that this witness is very unsure of herself on most points. Joe Ball, one of the lawyers, said that her testimony was full of mistakes and utterly unreliable. Liebler, another attorney, said that her testimony was contradictory and worthless. In fact, Joe Ball, the following year, in a public debate up in New York City, called Helen Markham an utter screwball. And then the classic comment on all this was they were complaining about the quality of this eyewitness. And Norm Redlich, one of the attorneys, told Liebler, the commission wants to believe Mrs. Markham, and that's all there is to it. That's a verbatim quote. The commission wants to believe Mrs. Markham, and that's all there is to it. That's the kind of sham investigation Warren Commission conducted. Bill Scoggins was another key witness, the taxi driver sitting there eating his lunch, and they tell us he identified Oswald out of a lineup where Oswald was just mad as hell and saying the police were railroading him and he wanted an attorney, and he was just ranting and raving, just furious, saying these lineups are wrong, you shouldn't be putting me in here with these people, and I don't look like them, they're not dressed like me, and I'm being railroaded, and I want my lawyer. And, Scoggins, he didn't have to be real bright to figure out who the guy is. So then the FBI interviewed Scoggins 2 days after this lineup, and they showed him a photograph of Oswald, and according to the FBI report, Scoggins could not be certain the person he observed in Oak Cliff on November 22nd was actually identical with Oswald. And in fact, when Scoggins appeared before the Warren Commission, he admitted somewhat sheepishly that he had selected the wrong photo. He'd selected the photo of a man other than Oswald as Tippit's killer. The ballistics evidence. 4 bullets taken out of Tippit's body, 4 shells recovered at the scene, open shut case. Wrong. There was, as the commission attorney said, a slight problem. That's another verbatim quote. They didn't match up. The bullets didn't match up with the shells as far as the manufacturer. The bullets in Tippit's body, there were 3 made by Western Company and 1 by Remington. But the shells purportedly recovered at the scene, there were 2 Western and 2 Remington. They didn't match up, and the Warren Commission was unable to offer a plausible explanation for that. The bullets removed from Tippit's body were never traced to Oswald's revolver. You can look it up. FBI couldn't trace them to that revolver. Many years later, the House Select Committee, using all the advances in technology and sophisticated methods for testing these kinds of things, were unable to match those bullets to Oswald's revolver. In fact, the only tangible evidence linking Oswald's revolver to the Tippit murder are the 4 shell casings. And there's no question that those shells came from Oswald's revolver. But when they were fired in that revolver is another question altogether. And in fact, the second description of the Tippit gunman to go out over the police radio stated that the gunman was apparently armed with a .32 caliber dark finish automatic pistol. Well, that's just great because Oswald was carrying a revolver. A revolver and an automatic pistol are 2 types of handguns altogether, and they fire different kinds of ammunition. You can't put automatic ammunition in a revolver and fire it. And then a few minutes after that reference to a .32 caliber dark finish automatic, Jerry Hill of the police went over the radio and notified the dispatcher, the shell at the scene indicates the suspect is armed with a .38 caliber automatic rather than a pistol. And he meant to say revolver, but he's differentiating between an automatic and a revolver. With a revolver, you have to manually eject the shells. With an automatic handgun, as you fire, the shells eject automatically. And there's 2 references to an automatic handgun that went out over the police radio that day. Oswald didn't have an automatic handgun at the time of his arrest. And then there was an officer named J.M. Poe who received 2 of the 4 shell casings at the scene. And he scratched his initials on them as part of the chain of evidence. And the shells, incidentally, were retained by the Dallas police for more than a week. A lot of the evidence was turned over that night to the FBI, but the shell casings were retained by the Dallas police for a week before they turned them over. So 7 months after all this, the FBI went to Poe and said, we need you to identify these shell casings. And they had all 4 of them. They wanted him to pick out the 2 that he had scratched his initials on. So the FBI report says Poe stated he recalled marking these cases, but he stated after a thorough examination of the 4 cartridges shown to him on June 12, 1964, he cannot locate his marks. Therefore, he cannot positively identify any of these cartridges as being the same ones he received on November 22nd. Now, that's reassuring, isn't it? And then the bullets, originally the Dallas police told the FBI that they only had 1 bullet, and that was turned over. It was a bullet that had he was shot 4 times. He was hit once in the head, 3 times in the chest. One of these bullets struck a button, and it didn't really penetrate his chest. And so that bullet was turned over. And the FBI was told by the police that was all the bullets they had. Well, many months later, the Warren Commission sent the FBI down to Dallas and asked them to find out what's going on here. And they found the 3 additional bullets in police files. Now, what was that all about? They found a jacket over not far from the Tippit murder, just a couple blocks over at a service station. It had a little parking lot on the side, and police recovered a white jacket thrown up under one of the cars. And they said Oswald threw it down trying to change his appearance. And all the contemporaneous reports to that jacket are white. But the jacket that was ultimately turned over to the Warren Commission and is up in the National Archives is a gray jacket. And I've held this jacket in my hands and examined it, and it's a gray jacket. You might call it a light gray jacket, but you damn sure wouldn't call it a white jacket. And a policeman investigating the murder of a brother officer is not going to make a mistake like that and call a white jacket a gray jacket. And for many years, we didn't know who this officer was that found the jacket. The Warren report credited another officer who had testified explicitly that he didn't find the jacket, he didn't even see the jacket. And yet the Warren report comes out and they name him as the guy that found it. Well, years later, I was able to identify the officer who did find the jacket, and I called him up on the telephone and asked him about this. And he was kind of evasive, and when I asked him what color was the jacket, he got mad and he said, who are you and what are you doing this for? He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, that information might be something they don't want given out. And he hung up on me. And what was that all about? The jacket that was found had a laundry tag in it. And the Dallas police didn't have any means to trace the laundry tag, so they gave it to the FBI, and the FBI tried to trace the laundry tag. And they canvassed all the dry cleaning establishments in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, as well as the New Orleans area where Oswald had lived the summer of '63. And they were never able to trace the laundry tag on this jacket, even though the tag was an indication that it had been recently dry cleaned. There should have been some kind of record. And I've got all the this wasn't in the Warren report. They never mentioned that there was a laundry tag on this jacket, and they weren't able to trace it. They never mentioned it. 900 pages in the Warren report, that's not in there. And I've got all the unpublished documents on this FBI investigation, and it was really a sham. They came real close to identify, they almost narrowed it down to 7 dry cleaners that used the particular type of marking mechanism. There were only just a handful of laundries here in Dallas that used that particular kind that was on this laundry tag. And they could have come, they came real close to tracing the laundry tag, but they didn't. So that's just some of the highlights, some of the problems in the Tippit murder. Now, Jefferson Davis Tippit. Where the hell did that come from? For years I have been reading in books, Jefferson Davis Tippit, Jefferson Davis Tippit. That wasn't his name. Where did that come from? That's not his name. What did J.D. stand for? It didn't stand for anything. His father gave him the initials J.D. in lieu of a name. His father, Tippit's sister told me that his father had been reading a little old dime novel, and it was some kind of action-packed thriller, and the father was so fond of the main character in this little novel that he named his oldest son, J.D. So where this Jefferson Davis Tippit come from, I just don't know, but I keep reading it, even books coming out this year, I'm still reading Jefferson Davis Tippit. But Sylvia Marr, who wrote the Bible for assassination researchers, Accessories After the Fact, it is the definitive dissection of the Warren report, and she dissed them. If y'all know how the young people talk, she dissed them. But this is a quote from her book. When we turn to J.D. Tippit, we find no biographical excesses such as they had with Ruby and Oswald, but extreme reticence. Tippit, the policeman, and the man is one-dimensional and is a one-dimensional and insubstantial figure, unknown and unknowable. The Warren Commission was not interested in Tippit's life and apparently interested in his death only to the extent that it could be ascribed to Oswald, despite massive defects in the evidence against him. The Warren Commission's profound lack of interest in Tippit may be measured by its failure to take testimony from his widow, who probably saw him less than 2 hours before his death. And in fact, the unpublished documents up in the National Archives show that the idea to do a background investigation of Tippit came up just almost literally as an afterthought. On May 8th of '64, one of the staff attorneys wrote a memo to the chief counsel. As far as I can tell, none of the areas is responsible for handling any of the background or connections of Officer Tippit. Since he has been linked to both Oswald and Ruby by various rumors, and since he was a principal figure in the events of November 22nd, I was wondering if any investigation of him has been undertaken. So that was May 8th. And then on May 12th, Rankin, the chief counsel, wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover asking him to conduct a limited background investigation of Officer Tippit. And Rankin closed his letter by saying, "As I am sure you are aware, this request is designed to obtain certain basic information which can be relied upon to refute unfounded allegations which have developed in the course of this investigation." Now, they hadn't even conducted the damned investigation. How did they know these rumors were unfounded? And then Chief Curry was going to come in and testify, and he was going to bring Tippit's DPD personnel file. So one of the attorneys wrote a memo to Rankin on April 20th saying, Chief Curry will bring with him the personnel file of Officer Tippit. It might be advisable to establish Tippit's good reputation in the department during the examination of Chief Curry. You know, not establish was Tippit a good cop or a bad cop or a son of a bitch. We're going to establish his good reputation. The conclusion comes before the questioning and investigation. Now that's the kind of sham investigation they did on the Tippit murder. Who was Tippit? We don't know a lot about Tippit. He was born up in Red River County up here in northeast Texas, about 100 miles, 120 miles from Dallas. Was a good old East Texas farm boy. The place where Rick Nelson's plane crashed, you know Ricky Nelson, Ozzie and Harriet, he was killed in a plane crash back in 1985. And the place where this plane crashed and burned was just real near, I mean just within a real close proximity to the area where Tippit was born and grew up. It was not a town, it was just rural farming communities back at that time. But the FBI did a sort of a evaluation. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, when they asked Hoover to do the limited background investigation, that was on May 12th. Well, by May 20th, Hoover had the whole report in hand. That's how quickly they conducted the investigation. But here's some, let me just read you a few excerpts from the FBI background investigation on Tippit. In his personnel file with the police department was a psychiatric evaluation. He joined the department in 1952, had been on the force 11 years without promotion at the time of his death. Now he had a limited education. He dropped out of school in about the 10th grade. He was not very bright at all. He dropped out of school because he didn't care about school and couldn't get passing grades. He had no hope of advancement in the police department because he couldn't pass the written test. And he was not particularly ambitious. He had no real desire to advance within the department. He was quite content just being a patrolman and going about his business. A psychiatric report dated November 17, 1952 characterizes Tippit as wholly devoid of imaginative facilities. I don't have to translate that for you, do I? It indicated his interests and achievements were limited and that his mental functioning and thinking corresponded with the community at large. And that's not real reassuring. His grip on reality was below average, and it was noted that errors of judgment could be expected. During Tippit's career as a police officer, he received several minor injuries, which included a dog bite in 1957 and a laceration from a prisoner in January 1956. His most serious injury was during April 56 when he was stabbed in the abdomen and knee by a mentally deranged person. It was later found that part of the ice pick was embedded in his kneecap, which required surgery to remove. Because of this injury, he had considerable difficulty with his knee from then on. While a police officer, Tippit was charged with failure to respond to 3 radio dispatches, all of a minor nature. He was criticized by citizens for discourtesy after issuing a traffic summons. However, investigation of this charge indicated the citizen was disgruntled and probably lied. Tippit also failed to appear at scheduled court appearances on 3 occasions, which resulted in a 1-day suspension without pay on his second dereliction. He got some accommodations and awards for being courteous to a motorist. Was the recipient of a Superior Award based primarily on an incident in 1956 whereby Tippit and his partner received a call for a routine investigation at a bar where a white intoxicated male was present. When asked to leave, this man attempted to shoot Tippit in the head. However, the gun did not fire. Now, that's like deja vu. Now, where have we heard that before? Tippit and his partner drew their service revolvers and killed the individual who was later identified as Leonard Garland, who was wanted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for an offense he committed in another state. I went pretty deeply into Tippit's background, his police career, his personal life, and there's not a lot mysterious or complex or suspect about Tippit. He was a pretty simple guy, as we've indicated. He wasn't too bright, and he liked playing dominoes and fishing and hunting. He had no interest in politics, didn't read newspapers. We don't know of anything, KKK, John Birch, nothing to indicate that he had any interest whatsoever in these kinds of things. Just a good old boy. He worked a lot of odd jobs on the police department. He had a part-time job at Austin's Barbecue for 2 or 3 years, and worked just about all the odd jobs that he could. And probably the most interesting thing that I found out about Officer Tippit was that he had a weakness for women. And he got around. And he especially liked waitresses. Some of these cops had a thing for strippers. Dean and Olson, some of these guys, they had a thing for strippers, but Tippit had a thing for waitresses, and got to know some of them pretty well. And with his sexual proclivities, he I guess you could say he was kind of a poor man's JFK, or a redneck JFK. And I never turned up anything to indicate that Tippit and Oswald, knew each other or were known to each other. I never had the impression that Tippit was the kind of guy that would enter into a conspiracy if he were approached for such a thing, would agree to do that. My read on it is it would be out of character for him, and I was never able to link him with a plot or a conspiracy. There's all kinds of conjecture over the years that Tippit was supposed to kill Oswald or pick Oswald up and take him to Redbird Airport, and then there's been all kinds of stories over the years, and I know that Shari and Beverly possibly maybe would have said they've seen Officer Tippit at one time or another in the club, and I don't know, but my impression is that Tippit was more VFW. Ruby was Carousel Club, and Tippit was just not in that orbit. He'd been more comfortable at a VFW, maybe drinking a beer and shooting the bull with the boys and playing dominoes and that kind of thing, And there was just not a lot about Tippit that was too complex or mysterious. Now, there was one troublesome thing that came up when Chief Curry, the Dallas Police, testified before the Warren Commission. Well, Alan Dulles, the former CIA director, was sitting in there, and just out of the blue, he said to Curry, well, a rumor reached me that Officer Tippit had been involved in some kind of narcotics trouble. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And of course, Curry was unable to tell him anything about that. And that's kind of mysterious, because I feel sure Alan Dulles didn't pick up his information off the street. There had to be some basis for this, but I must tell you it would be out of character from everything I picked up about Tippit for him to be involved in some kind of narcotics trafficking and so forth. And so that's just some of the information I wanted to share with you about Tippit himself, because there's not a lot in the public record about Tippit. And I see that, boy, we're really running down on the time, and I'm wondering, if you want to throw a few questions at me, I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And I guess they're taping this, so if you have a question, if you could maybe come down to the microphone so that they can pick it up on the video track. Be my guest.
Larry, do we have any way of knowing whether or not Oswald's gun was fired that day?
Well, it's like with the Manacano rifle up on the 6th floor. There's nothing in the public record to suggest that it was swabbed, and that's like just a basic routine investigative procedure, but nowhere in the public record does that appear.
One other real quick question. There was a police report that someone left and went to the library from the scene. How does that pan out?
Well, what it was, after this fellow shot Tippit, he ran, and if you follow the progress of the investigation on the police radio, there are repeated references to him running down the alley. He's running down the alley. We got an eyewitness that says he's going down the alley, and they're chasing him down the alley. And finally, somebody, and this is on the police radio, saw him run into an old church that's over there a block from where Tippit was killed. And they were getting ready to go in. Jerry Hill went on the police radio, "Oh, give me some squads over here. We got an eyewitness said you ran in this church. We're going to go in and shake it down." And they were getting ready to do that, and then all of a sudden the police transmission came over the radio. "Oh my God, he's running into the library down at Jefferson Boulevard." And so all the patrols pack up and go down there, and they run down there, and it turned out it was some guy that worked there running in to tell them that John F. Kennedy had been shot.
Hi, Larry. It's always a pleasure to see you. Ross Ralston from Minnesota.
By the way, Ross wrote a real neat book that we need to get back in print. It came out in the 1970s called History's Verdict, the Acquittal of Lee Harvey Oswald, and it makes a very compelling case for Oswald's innocence in both the Kennedy and Tippit murders.
Okay, I've got a bunch of stuff to not only ask questions, but just food for thought. I thought it was an interesting quote that Tippit was, quote, "wholly devoid of imaginatory facilities." Okay, here's a man who never had a promotion for so many years, and he sees the back of a man's head, according to the Warren Ford Dulles Boggs Russell Cooper McCloy Commission, and he connects him with the description on the police radio. I mean, that's their version. Now, he's looking for a guy 165 to 175 pounds. That's a light heavyweight boxer. Oswald is slender, weighs 136 pounds. He's 10 years off in age. He's looking for a guy in his early 30s. Oswald is 24. And this man, who never had a promotion, wholly devoid of imaginatory faculties, suddenly decides the time has come to act. Well, that's going to be his last act if that's what happened. I'll tell you that. And so I really wonder about why the man was stopped. And that's not even assuming it's Oswald. But let's move on from there. Henry Wade is an interesting character, and you mentioned him on several times during the course of this symposium. JFK. Should I call him Jefferson Davis Tippit anymore?
Let's not.
I think you've put an end to that. 2 teens and a Hispanic. Okay? Now, people in psychology, I'm working on my dissertation in sociology, but it's kind of close. We deal with criminology. You know, the psychiatry of the witness is well known. The witness isn't expecting to see something right in front of their eyes. It just happens. And the witness wants to be helpful. And they know the police have a suspect, otherwise they wouldn't be at the police station looking at a lineup. And with a little bit of prodding, like 2 teens and a Hispanic, it can be pretty easy to identify the proper party, the right person. And when Oswald was asked those questions, "Where do you work?" what did he say, Larry? Did he give them the truth?
Sure he did.
Texas School Book
The
Deposit.
detectives and the jail clerk gave fictitious answers, by the way.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, over the airwaves, people had heard the Texas School Book Depository. And he's got a black eye, doesn't he? That's pretty darn easy to spot. Now, what did Ted Calloway say during the courtroom thing with Jerry Spence? We want to wrap this case. He said a policeman said to him, what? "We're going to wrap this case up real good. We want you to take a good, how did that go? Good, hard look at the man and see the one who looks different." Well, I don't suppose they were looking at the Hispanic, but actually they all look different. The 2 teenagers, teeny boppers, and dang. But Henry Wade has a history. The Wade case dealt with lineups. And you know that it went to the Supreme Court. And he was chastised in 1967. He didn't have this right back then, to stack lineups. He did this in his office as a matter of business. Now, I could talk about the arrest, but I've been told just to ask questions, so I guess that's what I'll do. Scoggins, okay. Jerry Hill, I'm looking at the bullet right now. He said that over the radio, in addition to his, and you know that the automatics leave a mark at the base of the shell. And that's how you know, because it self-ejects. And if you don't have that mark, you don't have an automatic. And Oswald had the ancestor of that, which was what? the revolver, where you tap the bullets out. Let me ask you about finding those shells. I don't want to take up too much time. I understand everything is limited, and I'm not really asking questions as much as trying to probe and get a dialogue here going, because it's all food for thoughts. Poe's initials were missing. Can you admit those into evidence, if the initials are missing?
Had Oswald lived to stand trial? No.
Okay, the laundry tag. Now, can that be admitted into evidence, that jacket? Do you know Bellin changed the exhibit number in his book, as Jerry Polikoff noted?
He did.
From 162 to 163 to make it look like he identified a different jacket?
They brought the wrong jacket up, and Benavides identified the blue jacket as the jacket as the wrong jacket. And then Bellin later, in his book, switched to make it look like Benavides had identified the correct jacket.
Well, let's finish with this. There is one thing about Tippit, and I don't believe in guilt with association, but you said this guy is kind of, I don't know if he plays tiddlywinks or...
Dominoes.
Or dominoes, but he might eat pizza then. But they did say he was connected to John Birch Society, that he was an extreme right-winger.
Who, J.D.?
Now, not that it means a lot, but I mean, that is something about his background politically. Okay, what is your take on that? Is there any Birch connection?
That Tippit?
Yeah.
Well, he worked for Austin Cook, who owned Austin's Barbecue, and Austin Cook wasn't admitted a member of the John Birch Society. But as I've indicated, Tippit just wasn't interested in those kinds of things that I was ever able to turn up.
Talk to you later.
Larry, one question. Barbara and Virginia Davis, okay, did they see the person doing the shooting, or are they just recovered shells?
Well, I need a Valium every time I read the Davis sisters' testimony, because that was truly some bizarre testimony, but they were some confused witnesses. No, they did not see the shooting itself. They heard the shots and looked through their screen door and saw somebody running across their lawn. Mm-hmm. Yes, Jack?
Larry, I wonder if you could elaborate on two things that I've heard over the years. Two incidents immediately in the minutes preceding the assassination. I'm not sure you know about them, but if you do, I'd like for you to elaborate on them. One is the story that Tippit was seen in his patrol car near the end of the bridge leading into Oak Cliff within a half hour before the assassination, as if he was waiting for somebody to come across the bridge. The other is that within about 10 minutes before Tippit was killed, he ran into a record store on Jefferson Boulevard, made a hurried telephone call, and that was the last time that anybody saw him, as far as we know. Now, do you know anything about those two incidents?
Well, yes. There were a total of 5 witnesses saw Tippit sitting in his patrol car parked in the parking lot of a gas station sometime between 12:45 and 1 p.m. And he sat there as if just watching the cars come across the Houston Street Viaduct, which is the route that Oswald came across in a taxi cab. And all of a sudden, Tippit took off at a high rate of speed. Sometime around 1 p.m., there were 2 employees in the Top 10 record shop on Jefferson Boulevard, which is just down the street from the Texas Theater. And they gave stories that Tippit came rushing in and went behind the counter to use the telephone and made a frantic phone call and was very impatient, apparently did not get an answer, slammed the phone down, rushed out, got in his car, and took off at a high rate of speed. And that's they apparently are the last people that we know of who saw Tippit. And again, this was right sometime around 1 p.m., and we'll remember that at 1 p.m. the dispatcher called Tippit and got no response. Yes, Connie?
Do you have his Tippit's address in Dallas at the time of his death?
Yes,
and would you give it and describe what location it was in?
It was 238 Glencairn Street in far South Oak Cliff. They were new homes that had been built in the early 60s, and quite a number of police officers lived out in that area. It was nicknamed Pistol Hill because so many officers were buying homes in that area. 238 Glencairn.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, wasn't there a jacket or a coat that was hanging from the hanger in the back seat of Tippit's car?
Photographs taken at the scene show a jacket or shirt, I think it's a jacket, on a hanger in the back of the patrol car. That's right. Now, the police had a summer uniform and a winter uniform. They had already switched over to the winter uniforms, which were long sleeve. That day was a particularly warm day here in Texas. It was 68 degrees, and I suppose Tippit maybe had taken his jacket off and had it hanging in the back.
So it was his jacket?
I'm sorry?
It was his jacket?
We don't know. We don't know.
The other question, didn't most witnesses say that the gunman had been walking, west? Walking east?
Walking west on 10th Street, whereas the Warren report said east on 10th Street, and that was on the basis of the one witness, Helen Markham, the utter screwball.
Which direction would have been walking towards Jack Ruby's apartment?
If Oswald had been walking east on 10th Street, as the Warren report said, he would have been headed generally toward Jack Ruby's residence, which was several blocks beyond the Tippit crime scene. Thanks. Big Al.
Larry, I've never seen any pictures of the Tippit crime scene with the body. All I've seen is just the car. There's not even an outline of him on the street. Have you? Are there any?
No, they're not. See, when this shooting happened, a lot of people, a number of people started calling the police, and the Dudley and Hughes Funeral Home also ran an ambulance service, and it was located virtually just 1 block away. So the ambulance was able to get there at 1:18 p.m., get Tippit in there, and rush him to Methodist Hospital. So the ambulance got there before most of the squads began arriving.
Larry, that was my first question, actually, but as usual, he steals my thunder. The second one of the Davis sisters, I can't remember which one it is, claims that when she first saw the Tippit car outside the house next door, she didn't think it was at all unusual because she saw that car there so often, she thought he lived there. Mm-hmm. Have you or anyone else made any inquiries as to who actually lived in that house and whether there was a connection with Tippit?
Yeah, you know, I lived with the crisscross directories back in the 1970s trying to find everybody that lived in that whole general neighborhood. But it was a very transient neighborhood. It was a lower income neighborhood, a lot of apartments, apartment houses, duplexes, and a very transient neighborhood. And so it was very difficult to locate a lot of those. But you're right, Virginia Davis did testify that the police car was parked between the hedge that marks the apartment house where he lives in and the house next door. And Bellin, of course, did not ask, wait a minute, where he who? They didn't ask her, who is he? She seemed to be alluding to Tippit, but it's not clear because Bellin didn't ask her. Scoggins, the taxi driver, said, I noticed Tippit stopped down there, and I wasn't paying too much attention to the man, you know, just used to see him every day. Well, see him where? Where did Scoggins see him every day? You know, Bellin didn't ask the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question, Larry. I think you were the one to discover this lady named Witherspoon. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think most people would be interested in that story.
Well, I'll tell you, we really don't have time. It's a fascinating story, but basically Tippit had worked at Austin's Barbecue, become romantically involved with a waitress who was estranged and later divorced from her husband. It was a very serious relationship. Tippit wanted to marry her. He was willing to divorce his wife and marry her. She declined his marriage proposal for fear it would, just because of his family and his career. Relationship tailed off. She realized in September of '63 that she was pregnant, and it's just a messy situation. She told the House Select Committee that she and her husband, after she and Tippit broke up, she and her husband got back together in the summer of '63. Well, Ken Holmes Jr. and I, and Ken, you're in the audience, raise your hand. Ken did a lot of the work with me on the Tippit murder back in the 1970s, and on this story specifically. He and I interviewed the former husband of the lady, and he was very adamant in telling us that they didn't get back together until the next day after Tippit was killed. That he went over there and took her to the funeral home, and she just became hysterical and broke down and told him that she was pregnant by Tippit, and so they reconciled. The child was born 7 months later, and they raised it as if it was their own. And, it's just a situation that existed, and had that situation been known to investigators in 1964, it might have placed the Tippit murder in an altogether different light. And I'd be glad to chat with any of you about that afterward. But I have to shut this down, and I want to close with a quote. The other day on Saturday, I ended with a quote from Jim Mars, our brother from Springtown, Texas. This quote is from Henry Hurt, who wrote the book Reasonable Doubt. It doesn't have to do with the Tippit murder, but just the Kennedy assassination in general, and I want to read it because that's what this is all about. That's what we are all about. Talking about the official investigations. Despite these failures, it is encouraging that it was the very resiliency of the American system that prevented the JFK case from being stifled. A band of people, lawyers, homemakers, a goose farmer, businessmen, a mathematician, an architect, scholars, secretaries, doctors, professors, a weekly newspaper editor, photographers, even former government agents, would not swallow the official line. They began, each in his or her own way, their diverse work to get at the truth. Known as the critics, these people have managed through sheer diligence and persistence to keep the case alive and to inch it towards some plausible resolution. They have been denounced from some of the most prestigious podiums in the land, called blood-sucking scavengers, accused of personal greed. It is they who have kept alive the search for truth. Without their work, the evidence uncovered and the legitimate leads developed would likely have been lost many years ago. Without their work, the continuing quest for truth about the JFK assassination would simply be impossible. And that's what we're all about. That's what ASK is all about. That's what COPA is all about. And I would just encourage all of us to try to find ways to come together, to be more unified, to knock off the infighting, and to have more unity and solidarity, because it's time to get to the bottom of this case once and for all. And I just hope you've enjoyed this conference, and I say let's do it again next year because the case is still open. Thank you very much. Water